Marius haggard, Javert laconic. Let us narrate what was passing in Marius' thoughts. Let the reader recall the state of his soul. We have just recalled it, everything was a vision to him now. His judgment was disturbed. Marius, let us insist on this point, was under the shadow of the great, dark wings which are spread over those in the death agony. He felt that he had entered the tomb, it seemed to him that he was already on the other side of the wall, and he no longer beheld the faces of the living except with the eyes of one dead. How did M. Fauchelevent come there? Why was he there? What had he come there to do? Marius did not address all these questions to himself. Besides, since our despair has this peculiarity, that it envelopes others as well as ourselves, it seemed logical to him that all the world should come thither to die. Only, he thought of Cosette with a pang at his heart. However, M. Fauchelevent did not speak to him, did not look at him, and had not even the air of hearing him, when Marius raised his voice to say, "I know him." As far as Marius was concerned, this attitude of M. Fauchelevent was comforting, and, if such a word can be used for such impressions, we should say that it pleased him. He had always felt the absolute impossibility of addressing that enigmatical man, who was, in his eyes, both equivocal and imposing. Moreover, it had been a long time since he had seen him. And this still further augmented the impossibility for Marius' timid and reserved nature. The 5 chosen men left the barricade by way of Mondétour Lane. They bore a perfect resemblance to members of the National Guard. One of them wept as he took his leave. Before setting out, they embraced those who remained. When the 5 men sent back to life had taken their departure, Enjolras thought of the man who had been condemned to death. He entered the tap room. Javert, still bound to the post, was engaged in meditation. "Do you want anything?" Enjolras asked him. Javert replied. "When are you going to kill me?" "Wait. We need all our cartridges just at present." "Then give me a drink," said Javert. Enjolras himself offered him a glass of water, and, as Javert was peniwand, he helped him to drink. "Is that all?" inquired Enjolras. "I am uncomfortable against this post," replied Javert. "You are not tender to have left me to pass the night here. Bind me as you please, but you surely might lay me out on a table like that other man." And with a motion of the head, he indicated the body of M. Mabeuf. There was, as the reader will remember, a long, broad table at the end of the room, on which they had been running bullets and making cartridges. All the cartridges having been made, and all the powder used, this table was free. At Enjolras' command, 4 insurgents unbound Javert from the post. While they were loosing him, a 5th held a bayonet against his breast, leaving his arms tied behind his back. They placed about his feet a slender but stout whipcord, as is done to men on the point of mounting the scaffold, which allowed him to take steps about 15 inches in length, and made him walk to the table at the end of the room, where they laid him down, closely bound about the middle of the body. By way of further security, and by means of a rope fastened to his neck, they added to the system of ligatures which rendered every attempt at escape impossible. That sort of bond which is called in prisons a martingale, which, starting at the neck, forks on the stomach, and meets the hands, after passing between the legs. While they were binding Javert, a man standing on the threshold was surveying him with singular attention. The shadow cast by this man made Javert turn his head. He raised his eyes, and recognized Jean Valjean. He did not even start, but dropped his lids proudly and confined himself to the remark. It is perfectly simple. Chapter 7. The situation becomes aggravated. The daylight was increasing rapidly. Not a window was opened, not a door stood ajar. It was the dawn but not the awaking. The end of the Rue de la Chanvrerie, opposite the barricade, had been evacuated by the troops. As we have stated, it seemed to be free, and presented itself to passers-by with a sinister tranquillity. The Rue Saint-Denis was as dumb as the Avenue of Sphinxes at Thebes. Not a living being in the crossroads, which gleamed white in the light of the sun. Nothing is so mournful as this light in deserted streets. Nothing was to be seen, but there was something to be heard. A mysterious movement was going on at a certain distance. It was evident that the critical moment was approaching. As on the previous evening, the sentinels had come in. But this time all had come. The barricade was stronger than on the occasion of the first attack. Since the departure of the 5, they had increased its height still further. On the advice of the sentinel who had examined the region of the alleys, Enjolras, for fear of a surprise in the rear, came to a serious decision. He had the small gut of the Mondétour lane, which had been left open up to that time, barricaded. For this purpose, they tore up the pavement for the length of several houses more. In this manner, the barricade, walled on 3 streets, in front on the Rue de la Chanvrerie, to the left on the Rues du Cygne and de la Petite Truanderie, to the right on the Rue Mondétour, was really almost impregnable. It is true that they were fatally hemmed in there. It had 3 fronts, but no exit. A fortress but a rat hole too, said Courfeyrac with a laugh. Enjolras had about 30 paving stones torn up in excess, said Bossuet, piled up near the door of the wine shop. The silence was now so profound in the quarter whence the attack must needs come, that Enjolras had each man resume his post of battle. An allowance of brandy was doled out to each. Nothing is more curious than a barricade preparing for an assault. Each man selects his place as though at the theatre. They jostle, and elbow and crowd each other. There are some who make stalls of paving stones. Here is a corner of the wall which is in the way, it is removed. Here is a redan which may afford protection, they take shelter behind it. Left-handed men are precious. They take the places that are inconvenient to the rest. Many arrange to fight in a sitting posture. They wish to be at ease to kill, and to die comfortably. In the sad war of June, 1848, an insurgent who was a formidable marksman, and who was firing from the top of a terrace upon a roof, had a reclining chair brought there for his use. A charge of grape shot found him out there. As soon as the leader has given the order to clear the decks for action, all disorderly movements cease. There is no more pulling from one another. There are no more coat rise. No more asides, there is no more holding aloof. Everything in their spirits converges in, and changes into, a waiting for the assailants. A barricade before the arrival of danger is chaos. In danger, it is discipline itself. Peril produces order. As soon as Enjolras had seized his double-barreled rifle, and had placed himself in a sort of embrasure which he had reserved for himself, all the rest held their peace. A series of faint, sharp noises resounded confusedly along the wall of paving stones. It was the men cocking their guns. Moreover, their attitudes were prouder, more confident than ever. The excess of sacrifice strengthens. They no longer cherished any hope, but they had despair, the last weapon, which sometimes gives victory. Virgil has said so. Supreme resources spring from extreme resolutions. To embark in death is sometimes the means of escaping a shipwreck. And the lid of the coffin becomes a plank of safety. As on the preceding evening, the attention of all was directed, we might almost say leaned upon, the end of the street, now lighted up and visible. They had not long to wait. A stir began distinctly in the Saint-Leu quarter, but it did not resemble the movement of the first attack. A clashing of chains, the uneasy jolting of a mass, the click of brass skipping along the pavement, a sort of solemn uproar, announced that some sinister construction of iron was approaching. There arose a tremor in the bosoms of these peaceful old streets. Pierced and built for the fertile circulation of interests and ideas, and which are not made for the horrible rumble of the wheels of war. The fixity of eye in all the combatants upon the extremity of the street became ferocious. A cannon made its appearance. Artillerymen were pushing the piece. It was in firing trim. The forecarriage had been detached. 2 upheld the gun carriage, 4 were at the wheels. Others followed with the caisson. They could see the smoke of the burning linstock. Fire! Shouted Enjolras. The whole barricade fired. The report was terrible. An avalanche of smoke covered and effaced both cannon and men. After a few seconds, the cloud dispersed, and the cannon and men reappeared. The gun crew had just finished rolling it slowly, correctly, without haste, into position facing the barricade. Not one of them had been struck. Then the captain of the piece, bearing down upon the breach in order to raise the muzzle, began to point the cannon with the gravity of an astronomer leveling a telescope. "Bravo for the cannoneers!" cried Bossuet. And the whole barricade clapped their hands. A moment later, squarely planted in the very middle of the street, astride of the gutter, the piece was ready for action. A formidable pair of jaws yawned on the barricade. "Come, merrily now!" ejaculated Courfeyrac. "That's the brutal part of it. After the fillip on the nose, the blow from the fist. The army is reaching out its big paw to us. The barricade is going to be severely shaken up. The fusillade tries, the cannon takes. It is a piece of 8, new model, brass," added Combeferre. "Those pieces are liable to burst as soon as the proportion of 10 parts of tin to 100 of brass is exceeded. The excess of tin renders them too tender. Then it comes to pass that they have caves and chambers when looked at from the vent hole. In order to obviate this danger, and to render it possible to force the charge, it may become necessary to return to the process of the 14th century, hooping, and to encircle the piece on the outside with a series of unwelded steel bands, from the breech to the trunnions. In the meantime, they remedy this defect as best they may. They manage to discover where the holes are located in the vent of a cannon, by means of a searcher. But there is a better method, with Gribeauval's movable star. In the 16th century, remarked Bossuet, they used to rifle cannon. "Yes," replied Combeferre, "that augments the projectile force, but diminishes the accuracy of the firing. In firing at short range, the trajectory is not as rigid as could be desired. The parabola is exaggerated. The line of the projectile is no longer sufficiently rectilinear to allow of its striking intervening objects. Which is, nevertheless, a necessity of battle, the importance of which increases with the proximity of the enemy and the precipitation of the discharge. This defect of the tension of the curve of the projectile in the rifled cannon of the 16th century arose from the smallness of the charge. Small charges for that sort of engine are imposed by the ballistic necessities, such, for instance, as the preservation of the gun-carriage. In short, that despot, the cannon, cannot do all that it desires. Force is a great weakness. A cannonball only travels 600 leagues an hour. Light travels 70,000 leagues a second. Such is the superiority of Jesus Christ over Napoleon. "Reload your guns," said Enjolras. How was the casing of the barricade going to behave under the cannon balls? Would they effect a breach? That was the question. While the insurgents were reloading their guns, the artillerymen were loading the cannon. The anxiety in the redoubt was profound. The shot sped, the report burst forth. "Present!" shouted a joyous voice. And Gavroche flung himself into the barricade just as the ball dashed against it. He came from the direction of the Rue du Cygne, and he had nimbly climbed over the auxiliary barricade which fronted on the labyrinth of the Rue de la Petite Truanderie. Gavroche produced a greater sensation in the barricade than the cannon ball. The ball buried itself in the mass of rubbish. At the most there was an omnibus wheel broken, and the old Anseau cart was demolished. On seeing this, the barricade burst into a laugh. "Go on!" shouted Bossuet to the artillerists.